Hello and welcome to the second Matter Over Mind podcast, or MOM, as I'm going to continue to call it. I'm Stephen Mather and I'm a business psychologist with a bachelor's in psychology and a master's in organisational psychology from the University of London.
And I'm Thomas, an experimental physicist from the University of Oxford, with a master's degree in theoretical physics and currently working toward my PhD in atomic and laser physics.
Great. Okay, so welcome again. So if you're here for the first time, then there's another one you can listen to. And if you're here for the second time, thanks for coming back. That's great. So we're going to follow this process that we're going to do every time, which is we're talking about psychology one week and physics the next, or physics one week, psychology the next. So, I like to think about it in these grand terms of trying to explore the universe one week and then try to understand ourselves, the greatest mystery of all, the next week. So what are we, so you're kind of leading it today in terms of the topic. You've been watching a video and you've got some thoughts, and I'll then sort of see what I think about it.
Sounds good. Yeah. So this video, sort of a Jordan Peterson video on YouTube, sort of talking about his thoughts on Harry Potter and the Golden Snitch. So this he sort of talks about sort of the archetypes of people and how each person sort of strives to sort of become their future self. And he sort of talks a little bit around this. So this sort of just idea of archetypes and collective unconsciousness. Could you sort of give a quick overview of that so I can formulate my question a little bit nicer?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool. So this is kind of Jordan Peterson's shtick, really. Before he became a sort of thought leader, he is a clinical psychologist. He's also an academic. So his background is in clinical psychology. So that's kind of important to remember that, I think, because that affects a lot of his views on other things, and particularly the sort of direction that he's come from. So the place he's drawing on for things like archetypes and collective unconscious is Carl Jung.
Okay.
That's Jung with a J. So Carl Jung was a Swiss psychoanalyst. Well, actually, he also was a psychiatrist. Actually, that's how he started. He became a colleague of Freud's. Obviously, most people have heard of Freud, Sigmund Freud, as I suppose the father of psychoanalysis. Jung was they were friends. They were very different ages, actually. Jung was a lot younger than Freud at the time, and they worked quite closely together for a period, and then they fell out, interestingly, quite badly, and they sort of became estranged, mainly due to Jung's ideas being different to Freud's. So interesting. Okay. These very intelligent men kind of not being able to get over some pretty pettiness, really, I would suggest, particularly on Freud's side, I think, to be honest. He seems to have been quite upset that Jung sort of struck out on his own and had different ideas and sort of disagreed with Freud. Anyway, that doesn't really answer your question, but that gives you a bit of background. So, okay. So the thing that Jung, I think, makes him interesting is that, like Freud, he splits the self into, or the mind, I suppose, into three parts. Okay. So Freud described the mind as the ego, which is the bit of us which is kind of, well, it is conscious, and it's the voice in our head, if we have a voice that says, oh, I'm going to do this today, or why did I do that, or those sorts of things. That's the ego.
It's just to ask, is that the same ego you talk about when you say, this character's got a big head, they're a bit egotistical? Is that the same, a bit too self-centered, I guess?
That's right. It's got a kind of bad rap in a way. It's that the word ego now is kind of associated with something negative, isn't it? So when we say somebody has a big ego or they've got an ego,
Yeah.
We generally consider that as a bit of an insult. But when Freud and Jung use it,
Hmm.
they and when psychologists use it, they're really talking about this the conscious self. It's in many respects it's the the driver of the bus. It's the you that you think you are.
Okay.
So that's the ego. Um, Underneath the ego, for Freud, you had the id, and the
Hmm.
id was the sort of animalistic, instinctive tendencies that we kind of inherit through our evolutionary past.
Okay.
So these would include things like sexual urges, the desire to kill or get angry, or so these are instinctive in many ways, and not necessarily always the most pleasant of instincts. In fact, to me it's interesting because, as you know, I'm a bit of a classic sci-fi movie buff. I love the old sci-fis, and this was the first time. It's probably the first time I ever recognized the psychological concept in the
Hmm.
classic film Forbidden Planet.
Okay.
Um, there's a spoiler coming up here, so if you've never seen the 1950s, if you're still waiting around to see it from the 1950s movie, um, then sorry about that. But the idea is that this great man who went to this planet, his id
Hmm.
becomes sort of personified as a monster, and so it's basically all the animal bits of him that come
Okay.
out and kill people on the planet. And that was the
Hmm.
first time I'd heard this. He called it monsters from the id.
Okay.
And I was fascinated by that idea, and I've never forgotten that. So it's part of the reason I love sci-fi so much, or sci-fi films, and it's also perhaps one of the reasons I got into psychology. But yeah, so the id is this animal part, and then for Freud, the super ego
Hmm.
was I like to think of it as the kind of voice that tells you, don't do that, or you must do this, or you make sure you tidy your room up, or make sure you don't tell lies, or it's wrong to do this, it's right to do that. So you could call
Okay.
it a conscience, but it's more about um, it's like a learned authority figure that
Okay.
is there to keep you in check, if you like, and that
Okay.
could you could hear the voice of your mother or your grandmother or your whatever sort of father figure you might have had in your head, and it's kind of that is your super ego.
Okay. So
um
in principle, if
yeah
you were to grow up on a desert planet, you would have ego and you'd have id, or maybe you'd have ego, but there'd be you'd be divide, there'd be no super ego about you. You'd just have, I guess, whatever. So, assuming you grew up and didn't die um, on this desert planet, so you just would you even have regular
yeah
ego at that point?
it's
What
a
would
great question, and it's one that it, it's sometimes something that psychologists do question. So maybe later we can get onto social identity theory, because there is a school of thought that says, in a way, we can't possibly have any sort of identity as an individual that has no contact with anybody. That
yeah.
our actual identity is partially constructed by the world around us, and the social
Mm,
interactions that we have. So I think there is an argument that could say that, without any interaction with other people, then ultimately you don't have those normal bits, if you like. You're more
mm,
like an animal. It's the id really that takes over. There
yeah.
has been some cases. I forget her name now. We studied her in when I was doing my bachelor's. There's a case of a young woman who was terribly mistreated by her parents. She was left in the cage with the dogs. So
Mm,
basically the dogs raised her. They didn't have anything to do with her. They put her in a cage. She survived because the dogs got fed, and so she
mhm.
ate what the dogs ate. She drank out of a dog bowl. She lapped when they found her. She was literally lapping. She would lap.
Oh wow.
She didn't know how to use normal anything really like humans. And she couldn't speak, of course, because
Yeah.
you have to be exposed to language
Hmm.
within the first I think it's about 18 months of your life, and if you don't get that, then you'll never be able to speak properly anyway. You might learn a few words, but
Oh,
you
that young,
just
really?
don't.
Wow.
Yeah, there is an absolutely critical period where you've got to be exposed to language, otherwise you'll never get it. I think it's 18 months. I could be wrong. It could be more like 4 or 5 years, but there's a critical period
Hmm.
that you have to have. So yeah, I think the answer to your question is probably you wouldn't have those other parts of your psychology if you didn't have social interaction, because language is such a big part of the forming of that. If
Mm.
you think about the ego, for instance, a lot of
Yeah.
what the ego is doing is it's kind of self-talk. um, if you've got no self-talk, then it's like thinking about our dog Pepper.
Yeah.
I don't think Pepper's got an ego, because she doesn't. I wouldn't think she thinks to herself, oh, I'm looking forward to my walk today. So,
Yeah.
so it's interesting how existence would be very alien, very different if we didn't have language. Yeah. So, okay, where have we got to? So we've got the ego, we've got the id, and we've got the superego. So this
Hmm.
is Freudian.
Yep.
Freud kind of sets up this way of thinking about the mind, um,
And just
and
to check,
also
so this
he.
is, sorry, just
Yeah, go on.
real quickly. So are these effectively just well-informed guesses from just observing people about their ways, or is there
Yeah.
a bit more of a, um, yeah, I guess is this more philosophy, and he's just proposed these hypotheses and they kind of just seem to match what he observes, or
Yeah,
how would you
this
make,
is
how
a
would you test these?
yeah, this is a really great question, and obviously coming from a scientist, is the sort of question you want the answer to, and it is my problem with this stuff as well. Actually,
Hmm.
um, I come from a psychological science school, if you like. So, my training in psychology was a science degree, so it's a Bachelor of Science. You can do BAs in psychology, interestingly enough,
Okay.
but mine was a BSc, and then obviously the masters in organizational psychology. That's a science. That's an
Hmm.
MSc. So it's I have a problem with this. One of the problems with Freud and Jung, and all of the sort of psychoanalysis and that sort of thing, a lot of the clinical stuff is it's
Hmm.
not scientific really. It's based upon the experiences of analysts working with hundreds or thousands of patients.
Yeah.
So, of course, I've got a lot of experience of dealing with patients, but it's not scientific. So, there's no proper experiments going on here.
Mm.
There's no independent variables or testing hypotheses. It's really just trying to make sense of their experience as clinical psychologists. Um, and that is a problem. That is one of the
Mm.
problems. It feels quite arbitrary in many respects. It's just a way to try and explain what they're seeing.
Okay.
So yeah, this is one of the weaknesses of it, and it's one of the things that I think one of the reasons why I think we should be quite skeptical
Hmm.
of a lot of the claims that people like Freud and Jung made, but also a lot of modern day clinical psychology. I'm not saying I'm against it all, because I personally have benefited from counselling. Let's say so. I think there's a lot of good there, but I think we need to be quite cautious when we sort of treat it like a science.
Mm.
Freud he did want to make psychology a science. He was at heart he was a rational thinker,
Okay.
and wanted to make it rational, as did Jung, but they didn't really approach it from a purely scientific. There's no scientific method
Mm.
in the conclusions that they come to. Um, okay, so just to go back to, so we've kind of been on Freud for a little bit.
Yep.
The last thing I'll say about Freud is that he sort of identified these the two parts of our mind, the conscious and the unconscious.
Okay.
And so a lot of the stuff that he worked with clients, was all about problems they had in their unconscious. And so a lot of the unconscious was basically things that for him were repressed. So these were
Mhm.
repressed feelings or emotions, or maybe bad things have happened to you in the past, and you maybe you've forgotten the actual events, but they've still left their mark. And so there's this part of us that is unconscious, and it the only way to sort of understand what's going on with some of these things is through things like dream analysis. So that Freud was big on dream analysis. So he would get
Okay.
people to tell him their dreams, and he would then interpret their dreams based upon the symbols that he saw. And Jung carries that on quite a lot. So
Mhm.
Jung has the ego, so he appreciates the ego. He also accepts the conscious and the unconscious, but the
Okay.
extra bit that Jung introduces is something called the collective unconscious, and that's
Okay.
something Freud didn't touch. So for Freud, the unconscious was the personal unconscious. This was
Mhm.
things that you either knew in the past, um, and had forgotten, or you knew or you had in the past, and you'd suppressed these feelings and emotions or thoughts.
Okay.
So at some point they were conscious, and they'd become unconscious. For Freud, that was what he was talking about, and Jung agreed that there was some of that,
Mhm.
but he also said that there was something else. And underneath this personal unconscious was a shared unconscious. So this is
Okay.
a a well of human unconscious concepts that everybody has. We share it because of our heredity. Um,
Okay.
so that's
Okay.
his bit. So yeah, you probably got some questions about that, I think.
So, okay, just to see if I'm understanding this collective unconscious. So
Yeah,
this is this unique from like societal expectations? So, for example, different cultures
yeah.
obviously basically have different unwritten rules that you kind of have to go about
Mhm.
life. And if you're from that part of the world, you'll probably kind of follow them without really thinking about it. And then if you're a foreigner to that place, it might take a while to. So is it that, or is it a bit more? Um,
Yeah, so he's really talking about things here that are shared across all cultures. And so this is
okay.
one of his arguments. This is one of his proofs for the theory.
Hmm.
Is and the thing with Jung is he's incredibly well read. I mean, I've been listening to one of his books, and I bought it as an audiobook, and just listening to it, it's really hard to follow. He's very very intellectual. He draws on classical literature through the ages, and
Mm,
so he's very well read and very interested in anthropology. And what he starts to say he notices is that there are some shared motifs, there are some shared ideas across cultures
okay.
in cultures that haven't had any contact with each other,
Okay.
or apparently any sort of mode of being able to share ideas, but they turn up again and again, and these are the archetypes. So
Okay.
really, that's what he's saying. You see in all cultures. So things like so I've got a bit of a list here. So things like the innocent, the orphan, the hero, the caregiver,
Okay.
the explorer, the rebel, the lover, the creator, the jester, the hero. You know,
Hmm.
these are the motifs that are to be found in Greek literature. But
Yeah.
if you go to Africa and speak to African tribes, I think this is one of the things. So he was born in the 1800s. So in the early 1900s, you know, there was still
Mhm.
quite a lot of isolated groups in the
Yeah.
world, and anthropologists would study these different peoples and come back with the stories that they told. And again, he felt that there was more they were more closely related than you would expect.
Okay.
So he puts that down to this inheritance that we all have as human
Hmm.
beings. Um, these are kind of ancient memories, if you like, that we end up having because we've all, we all come from the same, ultimately from the same tribe.
Okay.
Um, and I think he's quite vague about the mechanism here by which this happens,
Right. Okay.
which unfortunately, I think has led to quite a lot of misunderstanding, and I think sometimes on purpose as well. It's because he was interested in all these stories and myths and legends and the occult and all those things.
Mm.
He was pretty much labelled a bit of a whack job,
Okay.
and and I think people got the impression that he was talking about some sort of supernatural shared consciousness, um,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
like I suppose like the June books, with the Bene Gesserits.
Ah. Yes. Yeah.
He's not talking about that. So he's not invoking any supernatural voodoo here.
Hmm.
He's saying that because we all basically come from the same tribe, we're all he sees instincts as kind of the birthplace of these archetypes. So,
Okay.
no matter where you're born as a baby, you
Hmm.
have the instinct to suck.
Okay.
That's pre-programmed, hardwired, whatever
Hmm.
sort of metaphor you want to use. Everybody has that, and there are lots of other things like that we all have those same instincts. And
Okay.
so for him, if you believe that, which I
Hmm.
think there's a lot of strong evidence that, of course, we all do have those instincts. So we must have inherited those behavioral patterns
Hmm.
from our parents and so on and so on.
Okay.
um, then it's not a stretch to say that some of these patterns of thinking are common across all humanity. Yeah,
Okay.
so I'll pause there for a minute if you've got any
Yeah. So
questions.
I suppose could it not be the case that I guess the counterpoint to we will have these, I guess, base instincts that are kind of there. Could it not be the case that when you're young and as you're growing up, you kind of fall into like the example you gave. You're a baby, you have this, whatever, right? Um, could it not be that that's effectively one of the few simple actions a baby can perform, and then us, in response to that, have accommodated? Could that not be a counter argument to that?
Um, so the sucking reflex.
Yeah.
If we take that one to start with, so um, both Freud and Jung were familiar with the evolutionary theory. So that evolution as an idea had been around not that long at that point, but they were, although Jung is a great proponent of religion, and this is, I want to get to how Jordan Peterson kind of gets to his position.
Hmm.
He's very Jungian in this respect, but still they don't believe in the literal interpretation of the Bible. So, Jung didn't believe in Adam and Eve. He did
Hmm.
believe in evolution. So, if you think about the evolution of a physical um, characteristic of a human,
Hmm.
then the the idea of that is that um, a small mutation might cause something, pigmentation of the skin, or you know, lengthening of the tongue to make sounds, or whatever it is. Gradual
Yeah.
changes make that individual more likely to survive
Hmm.
long enough to reproduce.
Yeah.
And through genetics, because they reproduce, they've got a decent chance of passing that inherited trait onto their offspring. That offspring
Mm.
will then also be more likely to survive. And so you start to find that these characteristics that are advantageous for the environment in which they live tend to
Mhm.
be selected for, and those that don't have them gradually die out. So that's how we get variety. Um, so if you're saying that for physical traits, then you
Mhm.
again, it's not a stretch to say that you could expect the same thing to happen for behavioral traits. And again, I don't think there's
Okay. Yeah.
much. It's not very controversial to say that we evolved our behaviors in many respects. So, you know, a baby crying, again, that's another instinct. Why do
Mm.
babies make such a horrible, horrible noise? It's because it's really hard to ignore.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
You
That makes
know,
sense. Yeah.
it is. And so, and also, of course, there's the feelings of the parent, because um, you don't want to see your child distressed, even though it's part of their instinct. Um, so behaviors evolve as well as physical
Mm.
features. Um, so essentially, that's what he's saying is happening here, I think, to things like these ancient patterns of thinking. They've evolved because they were perhaps useful, just like instincts are useful. Fight or flight is another good example of instincts that, I mean, these are physiological as well as behavioral. So, the fight or flight response, you start
Mhm.
to have the sympathetic nervous system is talked about in Jung's work as well. So this is where you get adrenaline pumping around your body, and
Yeah.
this is so there's a physical element to that as well as a behavioral one. And yeah, we've all evolved those things. Animals also, of course, they either fight or they run away, or there's the freeze response as well. And
Mhm.
in my training courses, I train people in leadership skills, and I talk quite a lot about the fight or flight response as a leader. It's
Mm.
that's when we get angry or we get frustrated or we get upset and so on, and we can end up behaving in a way that isn't necessarily very useful in a corporate environment. But it's because it's part of our inherited makeup, so we have to think about that.
Mhm.
Um, so that's what is happening here. So, like a sucking reflex again, I would say that the most common sense way of imagining that is that, if as a young baby you're not sucking, then you're not going to live very long. You're certainly not going to live long enough to reproduce. So,
Yeah.
good suckers carry on living, and that's it's as simple as that. So I mean, that's a very, very easy case, I think, to
Yeah.
make for evolution as a force of behavior change.
Mm.
So it's kind of wrapped up with that as well.
Okay.
So where to go next? So we think about the collective unconscious. So I think it's important to remember that we're not here talking about some mystical, magical realm
Yeah.
where humans have some sort of shared consciousness. It's not that. It's the fact that we all come from the same stock. We've all ultimately we developed as human beings in on the African savannas, and
Mhm.
that's why we have the same sorts of behavioral patterns. The other thing to remember with the archetypes is that the archetypes are not fully formed in Jung's theory. So it's not like, I think sometimes people get a bit too simplistic about it. They think, oh, we've got this predetermined image of the wise old man, for instance, and we've got this
Mhm.
predetermined image of the hero.
Yeah.
Jung is quite he tries to put us away from that, or sort of head us off on that, and so he's talking about more just vague patterns of thinking that we then try to make sense of, and of course we will do that based on, I suppose, the world in which we live,
Okay.
and so
So
that
so
that's
so
the personification of them.
so is it okay? So you said it's not a fixed structure where there's like a
Mm,
checklist of 10 things. If you meet those things, you're X archetype. So it's
yeah.
more. Is it? So is there like a cultural element to it, or is it contextual, or is it just? each, could you, make it more local, like, each family or whatever, or each small friend of group of friends or something, or is it more? Yeah, I guess how bigger does it scale up in terms of population
Yeah, I mean,
versus how small does
it's
it?
human. It's humankind. You know, it's that big.
Hmm.
We're talking. When we talk about collective unconscious, we're talking about everybody,
Hmm.
every human that's ever lived. As
Right.
far as
Okay.
Jung's concerned, it's every human that's ever lived.
Okay.
It might be worth me just talking about some of the big ones, the big archetypes. There's four that generally get called the four main ones.
Okay.
Um, so I'll just talk briefly about those. Um, I just want to say, actually, just in our last episode, as we were talking about something, I forget what it was, but you said I'm no particle physicist, but
Mhm.
and so you obviously used your general knowledge of physics to talk about something that you're not. It's not your area of specialism. I
Yeah.
need to put that caveat for me here on Jung. I am not a Jungian psychologist. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I haven't studied clinical psychology, partly because of the problem that I mentioned earlier, because for me,
Mhm.
it's not particularly scientific. And I'm
Yeah.
interested in how the mind works and how, um, how it, how our psychology works, not
Mm.
necessarily when things don't work. I want to know how come we as lumps of meat have this inner world, and that for me is fascinating. So I'm not a clinical psychologist, but so that caveat said, we've got four main archetypes. We've got the self,
Mhm.
which he calls an archetype, the persona, the shadow, and the anima. So I'll just quickly talk
Okay.
about those. So the self is the whole person, essentially. So this includes the unconscious as well.
Okay.
So this is the conscious bit, the ego, if you like, and the unconscious um, as
Okay.
well, and that would include the bits of the collective unconscious that we've got as well. So
Okay.
that's the entire psyche. He uses this term psyche,
Okay.
and part of the thing here for a clinical psychologist in the Jungian tradition is that you're trying to help the person to
Mhm.
gain something called individuation. So this is
Okay.
where the person, the self, is really well integrated.
Mhm.
You become more aware of these archetypes and how they affect your thinking. And
Okay.
you, of course, as soon as you become aware of something, then it's no longer unconscious. But
Mm.
to some degree, you have integrated your unconscious into your psyche. So you're a well-rounded individual, and that, in a way, is the aim for human beings, to go through life and to to get this integration, to
Okay.
individualize.
So so you've got yourself, which so okay. So
Yeah.
each archetype, in principle, could one person at some point in their life check off multiple of these, or is it there's this group A of people, the 10 people in there, they're gonna fit this archetype on average. This group over here is gonna fit, or is it as me, for example, as I grow up and get older and whatever else, is it basically when do I become one of these archetypes? I guess when does a yeah.
Yeah, you never become an archetype. The archetypes are part of your unconscious, or
Okay.
part of yourself. So the archetypes are we have all of these archetypes available to us in
Hmm.
our psychology, all of us. So it's not like we are going to become the hero, or we're going to become the wise old man, or anything like that. It's not. That's not what we're doing. We have these archetypes available to us in our unconscious,
Okay.
that if we can understand how they express within us,
Hmm.
then we can sort of embrace all these different archetypes, and become a more rounded out person.
Okay.
But yeah, so we're all of them, basically.
Okay.
We're
So
all of them all of the time.
okay, so I guess just to sort of help myself with a little example. So I guess now these may not be necessarily archetypes, but for example, I guess yeah, a student and teacher. So whether this is the real
Mm.
language So suppose, if I go in to speak to my boss, say, and I could view it as he's the teacher because he has more knowledge than I do, and I'm the
Mm.
student, listen to this knowledge. So at that point, suppose I had access to my other archetypes, it would maybe put us on a more level playing field. So it would be less like he's the boss and I'm the underling, and more like we're colleagues. He's just more experienced. Is it that sort of thing? Is that the idea of being more well-rounded?
Um, no, not necessarily. You'd that specific relationship
Hmm.
is so this is probably where my lack of knowledge of of the deeper elements of Jung probably start to come out, because I, as a non-Jungian psychologist,
Yeah.
would describe it in very different terms. So
Okay.
I would I would say that we have identities and social roles that
Hmm.
are very familiar with.
Yeah.
So this is the way I would prefer to describe what Jung is calling archetypes. I would prefer to describe these things as roles that we've observed and learned over time, and that we
Hmm.
play those roles when the time is appropriate.
Okay.
Um, so the student teacher dynamic is a
Hmm.
really good one, and it's one I talk about in my courses sometimes. And I say to my learners, if you think about your behavior in this training room, you straight away come in, you sit down, you get your books out, you sit there listening to me. I expect you to do that. I say what we're going to talk about, what we're going to do, and everybody's okay with that, because it's a kind of set of roles that we're playing that is very well established. They
Hmm.
learned that when they went to school, and then they've seen it lots of different times, and so altogether we have these social norms that we stick to.
Hmm.
I would prefer to talk about it in those terms. If you're talking about it in the Jungian archetypes, you might say that we have this archetype of the teacher and this
Hmm.
archetype of the student, and so um, we have some expectations around that. Um, but I don't think it's not quite as literal as that. So
Okay.
the students and the teacher archetype doesn't actually have to have anything to do with being a student or a teacher. And this is one of my big problems with the whole principle. I think a lot of the times when you listen to the analysis, so there's the analysis in psychoanalysis is very important, because what it
Hmm.
basically means is using symbols or identifying things that you then interpret as symbols to mean something else. This
Right.
is this is the thing that Freud did a lot in his dream work, and also, of course, Jung did the same. So if
Hmm.
you're looking at listening to somebody's dream and they talk about, um, I don't know. Well, the classic one is a knife. In
Hmm.
Freud's world, if you have a dream that involves a knife,
Hmm.
then this is something to do with sex,
Right.
because
Okay.
it's a phallic symbol. So
Okay.
that's and you know there is that old joke. Sometimes a knife is just a knife, and that is the problem. It's I think over analyzed and sometimes over interpreted. So you end up
Mm.
there's a one of the cases in Jung's book. He talks about this man who was schizophrenic,
Hmm.
and he said, "Can you see this? Can you see this?" And he said, he pointed me to something he was looking at. There was nothing there, but he was trying to point out to something that was in his own head. Um, and he said, "It's a man, and he's doing this thing and he's doing that thing." And he said, "And clearly this means," and it's like, well,
Mm.
no, it's not clearly doesn't mean that. To me, it doesn't mean that.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of assumption that everything has to have this
Mm.
deeper symbolic meaning. I think this is quite dangerous, because it's exactly the sort of problem that conspiracy theorists have,
Yeah.
and religious fundamentalism has, in that everything has to correlate to something else. You
Yeah.
can't just be that this thing has happened, it's got to be linked to something else. And this symbolic sort of thinking, I think, is, well, it's not scientific, and
Yeah. Well,
it's potentially dangerous.
Yeah, I was going to say that's almost the opposite of or at least in physics, the principle. Generally, oftentimes, the simplest explanation probably is the thing. If I drop a
Yeah.
ball and it falls down,
Ugh.
maybe there's a little goblin floating about, and if he wasn't there smacking the ball down, it would just stay there.
Yeah.
Or it's
Unlikely.
something,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
that's quite interesting.
Yeah, and that's so that's one of the problems. Okay, let me just go back to these big four archetypes. The
Yeah,
other one, the next one is the persona, and that's quite an interesting one. That's the mask that we put on in front of others. So
right.
this is the person we let other people see.
Hmm.
It's the one that we present to the world. Um, and again, I think you can explain that in so many less flowery ways. Does it need an
Yeah.
archetype? I don't think so, because we learn quite quickly what is acceptable, what is not within our
Yeah.
social circle, and therefore we behave accordingly unless we
Mm.
want to be controversial. So I struggle to see the need for a lot of these. The shadow is an interesting one. This is the hidden parts of us that we really don't like, and so we sort of
Okay.
want to suppress these. These are
Hmm.
the aspects of us that are generally considered to be negative. So we kind of want to put those away, but they do cast a shadow because it is part of us.
Mm.
And then the fourth one is quite interesting because it's I think this is where we start to see some real issues. It's the anima or animus.
Okay.
um, but he really talks about the anima a lot more than the animus, and the anima is the female side of the man. It's the
Okay.
feminine aspect of the male
Hmm.
psyche. So
So is there an
um,
equivalent for the male side of a female
yeah,
psyche?
that's the animus. So
Right.
the
Okay.
for the female, the for the woman, the masculine part of her
Hmm.
is the animus. For the man, the female part of him is the anima.
Right.
But listening to the way Jung talks about these things, I think again
Hmm.
reflects the time that he came from. So
Yeah.
I'm not dissing the man, but it was clearly from a male perspective. So
Yeah.
the woman is dangerous, is enticing, sort of chaotic. These are all kind of tropes that um, I would argue, of course, in his world, that is the way that women were considered in
Hmm.
those days. Now, I'm sure if we do have any young fans um, listening, which I'm not sure we're likely to, but if we did, then they would tell me that are missing the point. It is much more subtle than that. And I mean, okay, fine, we know, let's talk. But I think when you listen to his actual words,
Hmm.
it's hard not to get the impression that the the archetype here that he's drawing on is this idea of the dangerous, the risky. But he does say that without this, the anima, then man becomes um, boring and predictable, and has no drive. So the anima is his drive,
Okay.
um, but it's actually translated soul. So this is the soul, as far as he's concerned, not from a
Okay.
religious sense, but the kind
Hmm.
of essence of the person. Um, so yeah, so those are the sort of big four. But as I said, I think these are better explained by much more, I suppose, rational means. But yeah, I suppose the circling right back to the beginning, the Jordan Peterson stuff. I mean, I don't know how much you know about Jordan Peterson and his kind of philosophy. Have
I've,
you
I've
listened to
I've
much of his stuff?
I've seen some of his content, but not. I've not. I don't really
Yeah,
engage with it all that much. Like I know he does stuff on evolutionary psychology and stuff like
yeah,
that, and I've watched some stuff um, around that. Um,
yeah.
but yeah, I've not really delved deep into what he's all about.
So I think the things that are interesting about Jordan Peterson is that he's very keen on religion, particularly Christianity. So
Mhm.
he promotes Christianity essentially,
Okay.
and so he's in lots of debates and so on with good old fashioned atheists, the Sam Harrises of this world and so on. They have lots of debates, but actually, if you listen to Jordan Peterson very carefully, what, in my view, and I'm
Mhm.
not the only one who says this, by the way, but he he's as much a non-believer as the atheist in many respects. But
Okay.
what he thinks is that, and this is perhaps is quite useful to think about, is that for humankind, for mankind's psyche,
Mhm.
we need some of these ancient archetypes. We need the sort of God figure, if you like. It's
Okay.
part of the natural state.
Mhm.
And so when we get rid of our gods, when we don't have our gods anymore, then there's something missing. It also, because our gods in a way come from us, it's part of our psyche.
Mhm.
Again, this is why I don't think he's a real true believer in the sense
Yeah.
that religion is. But if you think that we actually created our gods
Mhm.
as a part of us, they are essentially archetypes. If we deny that part of us,
Mhm.
then we are denying an important part of our psychology. And so that's why, in people like Peterson's view, I think, and I'm not a spokesman obviously for Jordan Peterson, but I get this feeling that he's saying that it's actually a bad idea to get rid of our gods because it's a link
Okay.
between our ancient past and who we are now, and so we become
And
a bit untethered.
so is this God as in like the literal meaning, like, the Christian God, the big boss, or is this like like a historical figure that's sort of almost mythological at this point? Is it like that, or is it literally just the definition of a deity?
I think Peterson likes, again. I'm feel like I'm on bad ground here because I'm not a student of Jordan Peterson's either, so I've not read his books and so on. I'm just going by
Mhm.
what I've heard him talk about.
Mhm.
Um, so if I'm getting it wrong, then by all means, correct me, anybody who's listening. But from my understanding of what he's saying, it in theory it could be any gods, but
Okay.
he's a big fan of the Christian one.
Right.
And again, I think he likes some of the tropes that go along with that. So the
Mhm.
selfless sacrifice.
Okay.
Um, I've heard him talk about sacrifice before, and I think this is where lots of us who are I mean, without getting into it, I was a very strong believer, and I'm not now. And so,
Mhm.
for people like me, I'm very clear about what is true and what is not. So for me,
Mhm.
if that didn't happen, it's not true.
Sure.
And the first time I heard Jordan Peterson was on the Sam Harris's podcast, and this is
Mhm.
going back about 5-6 years now. And they had like an hour long argument about the meaning of the word true.
Okay. Okay.
Honestly,
Fine.
it was unbelievable. It was just like an ontological battle, of how and the epistemology of truth, and it's like how can you describe it? And for Peterson, true, it doesn't necessarily mean that it actually happened the way that it's written down,
Mhm.
but it can be true in a broader sense. And this goes back to these big themes. So
Mhm.
for him, things that are written in the Bible, for instance, may not have happened in that literal sense, although he's often cagey about saying that.
Okay.
um, but they are true for him in a wider sense, and I this links to this idea of these ancient archetypes
Mm.
that are telling a real truth that's deep inside our psychology, and that if we don't have those truths, then we're in trouble, you know. And if you look at religion, if you take a comparative study of religion, then these same tropes do pop up over and over again. You know,
Yeah.
the heavenly mother, the father god, father figure,
Mhm.
the son, often dying, sacrifice. You know, these are very, very common tropes. Things like the flood legends,
Mm.
and so on. But and also, of course, if you think about movies and TV, which is our modern way of telling stories,
Yeah.
they are full of the same tropes. You know, we
Yeah.
still have those superhero movies, and there's heroes and there's villains and there's the trickster and all of
It's
these. So for
that's like the,
you
the
know,
the plot of Cabin in the Woods, wasn't it?
yeah.
That's more or less the point of that movie, wasn't it?
I mean, if you any story, you can easily identify these
Mm.
tropes, and for me, I think that's interesting, and so I don't completely disagree with the idea of the collective unconscious. I don't disagree that there are these archetypes, particularly in relation to these patterns of thinking, and that's why we have common themes throughout the world.
Mhm.
And as if we can leave it there, then I'd be happy with that. Where I
Mm.
have a problem is when we start trying to interpret everything
Mm.
in that way. So, you know, when Jordan Peterson's talking about the snitch in the Harry Potter movies
Yeah.
as being the god chaos or a symbol of chaos,
Mhm.
um, I mean, my answer to that is, well, okay, maybe, you know, I don't know. Ask, um, what's her name?
J.K. Rowling.
J.K. Rowling, ask her. You know, that would be the easy way to answer that question, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Um, it may or may not be. If it is, fine. She's done some research and she's found this thing that I'll incorporate that into my book. It's as simple as that. You know, it's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
some weird thing, you know, that suddenly happened. And and the other thing to remember is that stories and particularly the modern media
Mm.
feeds upon the last success. So,
Yeah.
you know, if you have a formula that works,
Mm.
like the hero goes on the hero's journey, has to have a battle, goes on a long journey, has a battle at the end, and you know, finds redemption or gets the ring or whatever it is that the mission required.
Yeah.
Um, if you find that your book or your movie sells well with that formula, then you're going to do it again. And I think there's a
Mm.
lot of that also that's going on in stories and literature and so on. It's but then you can't turn around and say, "Oh, well, that's amazing that all these things have the same
Yeah.
the same general structure." So I think it's that circular reasoning that was one of the reasons why I sort of stopped believing in that sort of side of things was that, you know.
Mm.
So yeah, that's as much I think as I can think. Is there any other questions you've got about that?
Um, no, I mean, I think that sort of kind of answers the question really. That there are allegedly these archetypes in the world, and
Yeah.
to be a whole person, we need to, I guess, get to grips with that. Um,
Yeah, I think the other thing, just before we finish, I suppose, just my other slight concern about and I think there is a growth of this philosophy,
mhm.
um, and I think there's one or two dangers lurking there that are starting to show themselves. So, one of the dangers is that it can easily be interpreted, especially in a world where perhaps young men in particular feel a little bit isolated or feel like, I don't know, maybe they've got grievances. Let's put it that
Mhm.
way. Um, there is a it can become an excuse to behave in a way
Mm.
that is not necessarily particularly conducive to a fully functioning society. You know, so the archetype of the man, the hunter, the hero, the strong man,
Mm.
um, there's something there that I think it can easily get a bit distorted and make young men particularly think that I've got to be this archetypal man because this is our ancient heritage,
So this is sort of the alpha male sort of.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's quite a lot of that talk around at the moment. So that's one of the worries. And there's also an essentialism that can creep out of this quite easily. So essentialism is a philosophy that says, that the at the core there is a thing that it is to be that thing, and that it's integrated into it. So the man has to be this way and the woman is made that way, and there's a lot of kind of sexist tropes that I think are being expressed now that perhaps weren't expressed so much before, and part of that is this this reliance on archetypes as being somehow a model for how we should be behaving, and that's not really what Jung was saying. That's not what he was talking about, but it can be interpreted that way, which is one of the dangers of a very vague sort of non-scientific type of structure that he has, really.
Yeah, I mean, makes sense.
Cool. All right, well, good stuff. That's our second one. And again, please don't forget to contact us. The email address is mindovermatterpodcast@gmail.com. That's mindovermatterpodcast@gmail.com. So if you want to send us some suggestions for things we can talk about, particularly physics and psychology related, then please do that, and we'll see you again next time. Bye.
Bye.
You remember to do it this time.
Yeah, that was good.